Here's our subject, and clearly perspective is a consideration. So this three-step strategy is often the way I draw, and it's always a major part of when I'm drawing buildings. The first step is to locate eye level. Now in a building where we have lines that slope at an angle, there's going to be one line at 180 degrees. It won't actually be sloping. Now there may or may not actually be a line on the architecture, but it's the place where if there were a line on the architecture, it would be at 180 degrees. Sometimes it happens to line up with a major line on the building, or it could be the tops or the bottoms of windows, or it could be in the brickwork or stonework lines. But finding eye level is important because it's the place where the perspective angles actually change direction. Above eye level, they increase in one direction, and below eye level, they increase in another direction. Now there is a slight downward slope on this street, which does affect the bottom perspective angle slightly. So this is our street level, and our perspective angle is actually more like this. That's not going to be a significant consideration in this drawing. So we find eye level because when we come to placing lines at an angle, this is the point all those lines pivot around. Therefore, it's important to know where it is. The second point when I'm drawing is I find what's going to be the most significant upper and lower perspective angles. So in this scene, this is my significant upper line, and this is my significant lower line. As I said, I'm not worried too much about the slight downhill that we have. What we have now is, and in this case, eye level is somewhere about here. Now, the important thing for getting these upper and lower angles correct is because it's within them that I'm going to create a fan effect, a fan pattern with every other horizontal line or every element such as windows, which is lined up on a horizontal line. So all of these lines potentially can hold the details that we see in our scene. However, I don't draw all these guidelines. In a moment, I will draw this, putting this into practice, and talk through how I used this three-step method and additional things I did in consideration of this particular scene. Now, perspective describes how objects get smaller as they move further away. And as this building moves further away up the street, clearly it's getting smaller, it's getting shorter. But as it moves away up the street, it also gets smaller in that it gets narrower, which of course is called foreshortening. And we also need to allow for foreshortening. Now, to find the center point of a shape when it moves back this way, we just have to add the diagonals. And that is the halfway point. Now, this building is made of 4 equal widths. Now, this is where the halfway point of this shape that I've drawn here is. And because there's 4, I can divide each one into 2 again. And we can see that as each quarter moves away from us, it doesn't just become shorter, it becomes narrower. So what I draw in here, I need to draw in here as well. And the third point is that whatever detail we have, which in this case is relatively simple, it's just 2 upper windows and a lower door and a window, we need to align with this fan pattern and with the foreshortening effect, with the narrowing effect. And we need to particularly look out for things such as the tops of these gables, because they also, the tops will follow the fan shape pattern. And look, this is where careful observation can help too. There is no gable on this house. However, I'm drawing freehand in pen, so I can't commit all of these straight lines on paper to guide me. Watch how I plan this out for accuracy when I know that every mark I make on the paper will be there at the end. And if you're finding this helpful, please remember to hit the like button. Leave a comment sharing your perspective experience or perspective tip. What's made it work for you? And if you haven't subscribed, why not? Well, let's have a go drawing this now. Well, let's put our 3 steps into practice with this demo. Now, I've already, of course, observed carefully this scene, but I need to work out the eye level in my reference. Then I need to work out the upper and the lower main perspective angles that we have. As I said, I'm not particularly worried about the slight difference with the downhill slope for the sake of this exercise. And then as part of that upper and lower eye level, and then as part of that upper and lower perspective angles, I need to do the same thing on the horizontal plane, which means working out where the halfway points are, where the significant halfway points are, where the significant foreshortening happens. And what I'm trying to do is use my pencil to get the diagonals of the main shape to give myself a halfway point, and then I use the diagonals of each of those halves to get quarter points. But then I checked and I looked and I thought, does this look right? Does each quarter become narrower as well as shorter as it moves further along? And of course the answer, fortunately, is yes. And it was easier for me to position the ends of this building because I could reference off the sides of the paper, the distance from the sides of the paper. So that made this a little bit more straightforward than if I were drawing this in real life. And I put this telegraph pole in first because it helps give an indication of the street setting. And I'm going to draw the car as well. Now you'll notice when I outlined, for want of a better expression, the box of the buildings, I didn't do a solid line because I don't want a solid line. I did a series of dots that just helped me position in my head. And I tried to even avoid the dots where the car was going to be. Having got my, if you like, overall proportions established, I'm now working on this closest one. So I positioned the midway point for being between the windows. It is approximately okay. I feel like my left-hand window could be just a millimetre or two closer to the left. And now, working on these decorative sections where the divisions of the roofline protrude into the facade, and also release a downpipe. So now I've got these main perspective angles worked out in my head, and I know where eye level is. I know I need to fan all the horizontal lines in ever decreasing angles from the top down until I get to the horizontal line for eye level, which I haven't drawn in particularly in this case because it's so low down, but in some cases it would make sense to do some indication of where eye level is. It will matter when I go to draw the effect of the brickwork, because I do want to give some indication that this is made of bricks, although I don't want the bricks to be overwhelming, and I do want to somehow try and get the scale of the bricks correct, which means they're going to have to be pretty small. So having done my foreshortened windows going along the top, I now do the same thing with the architectural features on the ground floor. So we have this doorway, which feels a long, tall doorway simply because there's a windowed section above where the door ends, which isn't particularly clear to see with the shadows. Now, having put this window in, it's clear to me I better try and put this car in. So I'm aligning the front and the back of the car and the height of the car with the architectural elements around it in the reference, and then around it in my drawing. Now, cars aren't a great strong point of mine. I'm not particularly interested in them, and so I've never really paid attention to looking at them carefully except when I'm drawing them. But it's the same principle for drawing everything. I get rid of all the preconceptions about what this object looks like, and I start to try and draw what I see. At times, I think of it as its three-dimensional form, and at other times with cars, I do find it helpful to see it as a two-dimensional shape that I need to reproduce. Now, I mess up the back wheel that we can see. I've made it too round. It should be more elliptical, and because it's too round, it makes it look like it's actually turned out at us, that it's not aligned with the rest of the car, or that the car somehow twists. And that's what happens when we get perspective angles wrong. Whether it's the side of a building or a wheel of a car, it creates a visual distortion from what we're expecting to see. However, I do manage to hide it, I think, fairly satisfactorily once I put the shadow under the car in. But for now, I'll do the architectural elements around it. And you can see how relatively simple and fast it is to draw this. Not this fast, of course, but now it's a case of filling in the features, the architectural features, within the lines that we've either drawn or we can visualize in our head. Of course, I don't particularly draw lines on the paper, but I do dots and dashes and various marks, which I try and position so that they're going to be covered. But I know that if they're not going to be particularly noticeable in the overall effect of the drawing with all the detail that's there. And if you see how I do the brickworks in a moment, you'll understand why many of the marks end up being hidden anyway. So I go right to the end now, and now I've got most of this detail done. I try not to make behind every window solid black. It's a bit of a shortcut to having to think harder or do anything else, and sometimes it's a good reflection of what we see. But when it's not, I find it's best to try and create the effect of what we see. It does depend a bit on what pen we're using and so forth, and the size, the scale with which we're drawing. But where possible, try and reflect what we actually see behind the window. Don't just make it a dead black space. And I'm pleased I noticed that there is a gap in the gable fronts, and that for some reason, very early on, by the weathering on the corrugated iron roof, that this roof line was changed. But the apex of all of these gables do go in the same perspective pattern that all the horizontal lines follow. And with grand architecture, where we have statues and urns and all manner of ornamentation, often on the top of balustrades and pediments and what forth, it's important to work out which of these align on the horizontal so that I can then align them in my drawing on the perspective angle. So now I'm adding the detail on the right hand side. So it's a fairly simple approach. Find eye level, because that's the point all the perspective angles pivot on. But once found eye level, find the main upper and the main lower lines, because all the perspective angles will fan out between. There are no parallel lines at angles with perspective. Every line is either slightly more or slightly less of an angle than the one before. And we want to capture that. And then whatever detail there is to add, we need to add it consistent with these angles. So important to work out what lines up and what doesn't. And of course, not just what lines up horizontally on the perspective angles, but what lines up vertically. So it's good to notice that the window that's next to the door lines up directly with one of the windows above it, but the door doesn't line up with the window above it. And that's the same in each one of these sections, each one of these houses. So seeing that sort of detail is important. And now I do my brickwork. So the brickwork course lines, the lines between the brick courses, need to follow the perspective angle. And I'm trying to make them light and not grab too much attention. And note particularly with the vertical lines, the lines to represent the mortar between the bricks, I've gone particularly light and gestural with those. A lot of them are just dots. I find that's very helpful, particularly when we foreshorten to one side, that replacing very small vertical lines with dots helps to reflect better the reality of what we see than trying to do little lines, which often ends up messing up our scale because they're just too large for what we see. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this 3-point approach for thinking helpful. I think it's a very valuable framework. I find it really helps guide my thinking, firstly, my observation, and then my initial marks in a very helpful way, particularly drawing directly in pen, where I can't remove anything after it's on the paper. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.